November 4th, 1979, till 444 days later, was not about extremists trying to stifle Americans or the so-called ways of the West. It wasn't about conflict between religions, because certainly Iran, to this day, according to the information this book puts forth, gives the indication that it really is a land of tolerance, as long as you aren't doing anti-government activity. People are going to criticize the extremism of executing the most severe of criminals and defending the state against the riotous mobs. And, isn't that what a government is supposed to do anyways? And we find out that these chants were, again, not some curse against the West for being the West. It was about actions of the government. We find those Margbar chants are not against Americans. It's against what happens with some of the governments. And it wasn't that they thought they were going after diplomats, because the students made clear they didn't believe that what they were doing was addressing diplomats, but they went after a group of people that included a lot of CIA agents, and it was a center of spying. So, you can't necessarily blame them for not knowing what to do about it. I'm not taking the purely political angle here. I know it's not politically correct to point out that the whole thing was about the Shah's oppression of the people, his stifling the religious community, and certainly there's the admittance that there's a difference between Islam and the way that state runs. The one that replaced the Shah. Because you can be religious, you could not be religious, whatever. And there are people that bribe their way into certain positions or other such things. Certainly, Shia Islam is no different than a lot of paths in the Islamic respect, because who you knew or who you descend from isn't grounds for political or religious authority in itself. Certainly those things can put you in a position where you were trained to do such, and perhaps you behaved better than others because of this position that you were in, but those positions in themselves are not the thing. And we find Mohammad Reza Pahlavi probably misappropriated or used wrongly $20 to $60 billion, but just like a lot of dictators, he probably only pocketed about $40 to $60 million. And if America did not put these individuals in jeopardy and just said, hey, we know he was a criminal that oppressed your people, we'll return the money he took from you, the whole thing could have ended on day one. It could have ended before that. Because remember, the general thing of the war machine is the people are expendable. And any abuses these people went through seemed to be because of violence and stuff initiated by the captives. I mean, they gave them nicer food than was needed. They, in general, made sure that they had, proper clothing and all that other stuff. They sometimes got them books and, various things like that. And they allowed them to celebrate their holidays. The 52 kept for the whole time were a stronger group of military and espionage individuals. But we find others in the July 11th release. Sounds like he was just a diplomat. The 6 that escaped were diplomats or scientists. The 13 released on November 19th and 20th, 1979, were mostly military. And of course, the 8 who lost their lives in the failed attempt at freeing the people, were of course all military people. One thing that we have in this book is an idea that what religious people may consider normal is considered as crazy. The people that just recite and repeat religious hymns and scripture and take their comfort in bibliomancy and regular reading of scripture and continual prayer. But honestly, no matter how worldly advanced what you do is, you can involve yourself in that remembrance. And I very much understand it's down to 180 countries, last I heard, that have American military bases on them, and other countries that have their politics messed with by the CIA, Mossad, and associated groups that, they want left to themselves. And diversity and equity is really not the Iranian way. It's more meritocracy and equality. So those who behave well, those who perform well, excel. And when it comes to vice, yeah, certainly there's vice among the people, but it's not a way of life. The openness with vulgarity and stuff, like right now, the Olympics are going on and there's censorship of, some of the individuals, and it's like, if it's really about sports, you don't have to see the immodesty. And some of the censoring is comical, particularly because, they're not given time to censor it in a more smooth way. So you instantly know by seeing it that it's censored. The Olympics, of course, were founded on the idea of showing off the idealized forms that these people had developed. And, the athletes used to all be naked. And certainly the opening of the Olympics, there was, all sorts of stuff. But anyways, the Iranians didn't want messed with by the foreign powers. And they didn't want, they wanted sort of an autonomy. And ever since this crisis, there has been financial interference with the well-being of that nation. And there's been some lawsuits and stuff, including against the U.S. government for, all this. And, the people that shouldn't have been, particularly, as I'm saying, diplomats, you don't attack the diplomat. I would say, particularly with them, they're sort of bystanders in all this. And when it comes to a lot of things, they tell the military men such and such, and their intentions are really different than the reality of what they've been put into, but they're fed this information. Just like right now, there's some wars going on, and, if some of the way it's presented was true, I would understand it. I may not agree with the methodology of the whole thing, but I would understand it, and I would say that there's an overall good intention, but there's not an overall good intention. This is about conquest and thinking that people have the right to not only a false ancestral land, but they have the right to any of their neighbors where there may have been people of their religion in the past. Of course, it's not about religion anymore. It's about that, transnational nationality, blood and soil thing that they've, come up with as a translation of something. But, again, the Baha'is and Jews and everybody else is tolerated in Iran as long as they don't involve themselves in anti-state politics. Vote for who you vote for. And people say, oh, well, the Ayatollah, it's like the judicial branch, just like some other roles. You need to have people who believe in the system and know about the system in order for them to be the operators of the system. It doesn't make sense to just say every single religion and every single race and age group that we're going to figure out the portions of the population, or we're going to have people from each of them equal and all that stuff. After all this went on, Iran established a system where Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, different ones within that, the Jews, different types of Jews, the Baha'i, the Zoroastrians. There's been representation in the government to protect their rights. And not big corporation lobbying groups, because they say, they're not anti-technology or anti-modernism, but they're willing to give up some of that because of, to keep their purity of their character. At least that's the intention. And if they're going outside of that, that's, again, as I said before, there's a difference between Islam, such and such government, and, some things that happen whether or not. Now, Islam does not kick out aspects of life. But as I've said, in regards to the 165 jihad verses and the 43 ghazawat, you do not have people fighting people for the sake of, oh, well, they blasphemed, they disbelieved, they apostatized. This is not what Islam itself is claiming. In Iran, people generally avoid getting married, but sometimes in Ramadan, they do get married. And this avoidance of marriage during Ramadan is because it's a trial for the relationship, and also the most meritorious month to get married in the Islamic vision is the 10th month. Zionism and the states thereof is seen as responsible for the actions of their puppets, the various wars they stir up, the oppression of thought and religion and other human rights, and the economic oppression. Certainly, individuals are responsible for their own choices. I'm not saying that. But this is the motivation. It's not just, some silly hatred for America or the disbeliever or something like that. Because, the students that seized them were certainly cordial to their religious practices. They may not have agreed with those things, but they certainly enabled them to, celebrate Christmas and have their Bibles and that sort of thing. There was a preference given to the filter of religious leadership, but there was no intention, both by those replacing the Shah or in those operating for the Ayatollahs and mullahs. We have the mention of the ta'aruf, which is a system of what Islamically would probably be considered excess formalities, which tend to lead towards problems, as the adage goes. The focus on martyrdom is about good examples. It's not about just dying for itself. Certainly, it can be considered in the context of dying in a consciousness, willing to give up all for God. There is the talk of Shia Islam as something of purification and tracing out causes of what's encouraged or discouraged. This book does throw not just a politically insulting way of, or a racial or nationality-based prejudice, but it also shows this talk of the green tinted glasses. You know what the green means in the Islamic flags? It means wholeness, surrender to God, development, that sort of stuff. The black is doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. The white is to take on the successorship, the self-mastery. The red, it's a power. It's of martyrdom. But there's a martyrdom of living a life. Living a life that sacrifices when needed to do the right thing. And after this event, there's even more of those posters, and even greater and greater focus on enacting the stories of martyrdom, of enshrining the memories of those who laid down their lives for, their freedoms and all that. It goes beyond what you would associate with patriotism. And right now there's a lot of criticism that the Iranian government shipped water to reduce the deaths in regards with pilgrimage and Muharram ceremonies and stuff like that. And it's like, oh, they took the resources from the people. And it's like, people die in the heat. People die of dehydration. And at the very least, it's healthier for those who aren't fasting to, have more access to clean water. And of course, less people got sick because there was, bottled water for people to drink. And government should focus on stuff like that. I'm not saying the religious side necessarily, that the government's taking taxes so the people who want to be religious or want to do religious observances are going to go off and do those things. I'm saying in terms of making sure that the food and drink that people need in their circumstances is available. And this book makes a fair argument that there's too much focus on who is a descendant of Muhammad and that sort of stuff, not just as vehicles of enemy powers, but certainly as corruption in itself. The Saudis are criticized by the Iranians. Saddam Hussein is criticized by the Iranians. It's, considering how wrong suicide is considered in Islam, the students did not want anybody to commit suicide or hurt themselves. So they went to efforts to prevent that sort of thing. And as I said before, the person that was released, that person, well, I mean, this is a monster book. It's 680 pages, so I'm obviously not reading this. I'm just bouncing ideas off of what I think is more important to talk about for the channel. The incoming government was a lot more about counsel and that sort of thing. So decisions were not as immediate. And as much as they are a constitutional republic, which is the American system of government, there's also the fact that they do not give their top politicians the amount of power that we do in the West. Now, I mean the portion of the power as well. Out of Qom was an idea of not using the state to enforce religion and not seeking power for its own self. The Ayatollahs and even mullahs are spoken of as prophets by outsiders, but that's because of the limited and otherwise corrupted idea of prophets that is had in the West. Certainly they're thinkers and all that, but, not quite to the extent of Muhammad allowing a Christian delegation to hold their church services in a corner of a masjid. But certainly the enabling and scheduling of special services for Easter and Christmas were religiously motivated freedoms. And that's one of the problems that people in the West generally have, is they don't realize that all these freedoms of religion and all this other stuff that we talk about generally is linked to religious motivations for them. Now, there was an additional set of motivations when it came to America, because the Protestants fought each other, the Catholics and the Protestants fought each other. The Orthodox and the Catholics fought each other. Different groups of Orthodox fought each other. So, they figured in order to have freedom as a Christian, we couldn't let any one Christian group rule. But in some ways, did we really do better for our freedom and security? Certainly, the wars and some other injustices in society have gone up since dropping Christendom. And I'm not saying to go back to Christendom. I'm just saying, that the difference is not the same thing as advancement. The talk about the great Satan and the little Satan is not a merely political statement. It's along that spirit of the worst false god is the serving of the lower self. And the serving of the lower self is exacerbated in the non-religious state. It is important for people to hold their religious services, not just when they think they have an ideal center for such things, but when it becomes possible. By knowledge, by willingness, or by other abilities. You don't need idealized buildings, but certainly the establishment of regular places for Friday prayers and all that is important. I am not justifying everything of either side, but greater freedom is possible.